for. So if this budget is bloated at the Pentagon, they can ask the White House about it because it's the budget that they proposed. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to my very good friend, distinguished member of the Rules Committee from Texas, Mr. Roy.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank the Speaker. I thank the Chairman, the gentleman from Oklahoma, who is a gentleman, giving me time despite the fact I voted against the rule in the Rules Committee. I respect that. I respect it immensely so that we can have a full and open debate here on the floor of the House. I listened to the gentleman from Massachusetts wax on, talking about governing. Well, we don't govern, Mr. McGovern. We represent. That's what we're supposed to do anyway, is represent the people of this country. Fed up with a government that is now 40% bigger since the beginning of COVID. A government barreling towards $36 trillion of debt, and an absolute devastating burden on the future of this country, on our children and our grandchildren, who are not going to be able to afford homes, not be able to afford to go to school, not be able to afford food, groceries. Talk about food programs. I don't hear a whole hell of a lot about what we're doing to devastate American families with rampant inflation because we keep spending money we don't have. To my colleagues on this side of the aisle, my beef isn't that I don't understand the struggle with the negotiators against that kind of reasoning. My beef is that you cut a deal that shouldn't have been cut. The fact is, at best, we have a 2-year spending freeze that's full of loopholes and gimmicks that would allow for increased funding for the federal bureaucracy in order to achieve a $4 trillion increase in the debt by January 1 of 2025. $4 trillion. We have permitting reform, which might have some good elements in it. But the problem is you have the Biden administration saying it accelerate implementation of the historic clean energy and environmental justice investments in the Inflation Reduction Act, the very policies destroying the American way of life and making them unable to afford energy and afford their food. We have watered down work requirements. The CBO just said will actually increase the cost of SNAP by $2 billion. A supposed 1% automatic top line reduction in spending at the end of the year that will actually make a Christmas omnibus more likely. A 2% cut to Biden's $80 billion IRS expansion. 2% of that $80 billion expansion. Administrative pay-go, I'm told. We're not going to do the REINS Act. We're not going to constrain the regulatory state. We're going to do a waivable administrative pay-go. Great. We'll pass a bill next week. Yay us. It'll die in the Senate. Why aren't we using this leverage? A complete punt to SCOTUS on the Biden administration's unfair $500 billion student loan bailout, billions in COVID dollars left untouched to fund things like vaccines and COVID-19 testing, and the loss of our biggest leverage points to force Biden to actually secure the southern border. I encourage my colleagues to vote no on the rule and to oppose this legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a report by the balance entitled "The Trump's Impact on the National Debt." Mr. Speaker, for talk about spending.
Without objection.
The national debt increased by almost 36% from 2017 to 2020 during Trump's tenure. I wish the gentleman from Texas was on the floor screaming then, as he is now. And he has no problem with spending trillions of dollars on tax cuts for rich people and taxpayer subsidies for big oil companies. But when it comes to providing people the basics to be able to put food on the table, he has a problem. We just don't share the same values. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Dr. Ruiz.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Let's be clear. This bill is not about fiscal responsibility. It is about extreme GOP pushing their extreme agenda. Extreme Republicans demanded to cut veterans' health care, to zero out the toxic exposure fund for sick, burn pits exposed veterans, to end protections for our environment and allow polluters to expose workers and communities to toxic chemicals for corporate profits, to cut Medicaid, cut child care, and cut education, and repeal efforts to make our air and water cleaner, especially in vulnerable communities. And if they didn't get their way, they held hostage the American economy and threatened to send America into default, raising costs for families, cutting 1 million jobs for workers, and devastating seniors' retirements. And so, today, under this Republican-manufactured extreme crisis, we will take up the bipartisan budget agreement to prevent a Republican catastrophic default. President Biden, in this bill, made sure veterans got the care that they need by funding the Toxic Exposure Fund for burn pits veterans. Keeps the Inflation Reduction Act's environmental and clean energy protections to stop polluters from harming people. He was able to protect Medicare, no changes to protect Medicaid, with no changes to Medicaid, and maintain healthcare access for millions of families across the country, and preserve funding for clean energy programs to clean up our air. Look, if extreme Republicans were serious about fiscal responsibility, they would have accepted President Biden's budget that would have reduced the deficit by $3 trillion. Instead, this bill only reduces it by $1.5 trillion. Nevertheless, today I will vote for the bipartisan agreement, and I yield
Gentleman's
back.
time has expired. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself just quickly for the purpose of response, such time as I may consume. I want to remind my friend from California, we actually filed a veterans bill that increased veteran spending. So that canard is just simply not the case. We from the very beginning, we're going to take care of veterans and file legislation to do that. With that, Mr. Speaker, I want to yield to my very good friend from Texas, my classmate and the distinguished Vice Chairman of the Rules Committee, Mr. Burgess, 3 minutes.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Oklahoma. I rise today to speak in support of the rule and the underlying legislation. Including within the rule measure is H.R. 3746, the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So, fortunately, the Fiscal Responsibility Act makes worthwhile reforms that will safeguard America's solvency. 100 days, Mr. Speaker. That's how long President Biden flirted with economic calamity because he was too stubborn to come to terms with a new political reality. The American people did not send a Republican majority to continue business as usual. Mr. Speaker, the typical business as usual where elected lawmakers come together in a lame duck session and knock the bottom out of the country's finances. Well, no more, Mr. Speaker. With the passage of this legislation, Republicans are putting America back on a sound fiscal footing by reducing non-discretionary funding, reforming entitlement programs, and adding requirements that Congress pass its 12 appropriations bills on time. That is a massive change from the status quo. I credit our fellow Rules Committee member Thomas Massey for the concept of including this in the debt limit bill, because if the appropriators cannot pass all 12 of their appropriations bills by September 30th, it automatically goes to a continuing resolution with a 1% reduction. That's the first time that has ever happened. So we have budget enforcement, in fact, without blowing up the filibuster over in the Senate, and we all know what that could lead to. No one can say they got everything they wanted in this bill. And candidly, I don't think the reforms, the permitting reforms are nearly enough. The NEPA reform included in this bill is an important first step, but there is no question that we will need to do much more. The full faith and credit of the United States is preserved with this legislative product. And bear that in mind. If the United States were to default on its debt, there actually is another country, the People's Republic of China, who would like to be the reserve currency of the world. We will not give them that chance when we pass this bill. I commend Patrick McHenry and Garrett Graves for their hard work in bringing us this vital piece of legislation. Commend the Speaker for bringing it to a vote on the floor today after 72 hours for members to read and understand the bill. I urge everyone to support the rule and support the underlying legislation. I yield back to my friend from Oklahoma.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentlewoman from New Mexico, a member of the Rules Committee, Ms. Ledger Fernandez.
Gentlelady is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are where we're at today, at the precipice of ruin, because extreme Republicans chose to hold Americans hostage by refusing to pay America's bills. Their chaos created fear and stress as Americans worried about a catastrophic recession. Extreme Republicans' ransom demand was the Default on America Act, a proposal which targeted rural communities, Head Start, veterans' health care, and more, with 22% and more cuts, all to pay for the Trump tax cuts for the wealthiest CEOs that added $2 trillion to the deficit. Rather than making the wealthiest pay their fair share, extreme Republicans wanted to balance the budget on Americans' growling, hungry stomachs. Democrats proposed amendments to the Default on America Act to protect programs like rural development and veterans' health care. Republicans rejected every amendment. So we went to our communities. We told them the truth about what the Republicans' Default on America Act would do. Americans listened, and they spoke out against the Republicans' plan. When Democrats and President Biden's team went into the room to negotiate with Republicans, the voices of veterans, seniors, and working Americans went in too. Now we have H.R. 3746. The bill does save us from economic catastrophe. It rejects the most extreme and cruel proposals contained in the Republicans' Default on America Act. It allows advanced appropriations for the Indian Health Service, protects clean energy tax credits, and the health care for veterans. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. I do not support many of the changes to our environmental laws and our social safety net programs. But let's talk fiscal responsibility for a moment. President Trump increased the debt by $8 trillion. In contrast, President Biden reduced the deficit in his first 2 years alone by $1.7 trillion while creating 12 million jobs, bringing manufacturing back, and making the largest investments to address the climate crisis ever. The bill today reduces the deficit only by $1.5 trillion. If we had merely passed the president's budget, we would have decreased the deficit by $3 trillion without creating the fear and economic insecurity that extreme MAGA Republicans have forced Americans to endure. I want to repeat this point. Let me repeat it. This crisis didn't have to happen. Everything in this bill could have been negotiated through the normal process without a debt crisis. Indeed, that's how it's almost always been done, except for in 2011, when the Republicans did this before.
Expired.
The American people need to tell the Republicans
Gentleman
no
from Massachusetts
more
reserves.
hostage
The gentlelady's
taking.
time's expired. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to my very good friend, distinguished member of both the Appropriations and Rules Committee, Mr. Reschenthaler from Pennsylvania.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the chairman of the Rules Committee for being generous and yielding me this time. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of this rule and in support of the underlying legislation. Today, the House is taking historic steps to address our nation's out-of-control debt. This House Republican win rescinds $28 billion in unobligated COVID funds. It cuts over $2 trillion in government spending. It reins in the executive branch. And it rejects the president's extreme $5 trillion in proposed tax increases. Further, this legislation will help lift Americans out of poverty and grow our economy by cutting red tape and streamlining energy and infrastructure projects. H.R. 3746 also includes an important provision championed by House Republicans, and that is to complete the Mountain Valley Pipeline. MVP is near completion, but the last 14 miles, there's just 14 miles left. The last 14 miles are being held up by extreme, radical, far-left judges. When completed, this pipeline will help reduce costs for hardworking Americans in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. It will simultaneously help the economies of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, with thousands of construction jobs, millions of dollars in royalty payments just in Pennsylvania alone, $150 million a year in royalty payments just to Pennsylvania alone. And it will lead to direct investment in rural communities. Mr. Speaker, I support the rule in the underlying legislation. I urge my colleagues to do the same, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to yield 2 minutes to the very distinguished gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
How much time? 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Maryland. You're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, there's been a lot of argument about who's responsible, why we're here. Mr. Roy, the gentleman from Texas, as I was coming in, spoke about keeping leverage. Now, what do you keep leverage for? You keep it so you can make something that you want to happen, happen. The Speaker of this House has said default is not an option. The leader of the Democratic Party in this House has said default is not an option. But that wasn't good enough that we agreed. It was, as the gentleman from Texas said, our Republican friends wanted to keep leverage to accomplish essentially in the appropriation bill, or what they couldn't either accomplish or pass in the Appropriations Committee here because of their extraordinarily devastating bill that they offered and passed, which some of them are going to have to answer for in the next election. But what today is about is whether we're going to hurt 330 million Americans, whether we're going to hurt the global economy. That's what this is about. And from my perspective, there is only one answer: to pass a bill that in fact does not have America welch on its debts. Or, alternatively, to defeat a bill which will devastate our economy and be catastrophic globally. That's why we're here. I urge every member to think of those 330 million Americans, all of whom will be hurt if we fail to do our duty. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to my very good friend, distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Molinaro.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the chairman. I have only been here for 5 months, but I already have been blamed for things I have and have not done, for action we did or didn't take. We're here now. We're here now at a moment where Americans, by design or default, have given us a bipartisan government, and the House Republicans delivered on a promise to hold the federal government accountable, and we have an agreement. That agreement will move this nation forward. I want to speak very specifically to one component. Mr. Speaker, grew up on food stamps. My mother, diagnosed with depression, would not have survived without that assistance. She was encouraged and worked hard and got on her feet and ultimately achieved independence. For the last 12 years, I've administered a social service agency in the state of New York. The Fiscal Responsibility Act takes important action, not at all to punish our most vulnerable. In fact, takes real steps to ensure those most vulnerable among us are protected and served and have access to the support that they deserve, and by the way, find their way to work. This bill holds states like New York and others accountable for waiving restrictions, expanding access, not to help the most vulnerable, but to bloat and to grow and to increase state government. Because of action states have taken, the most vulnerable are left to fend for themselves, demoralized, dehumanized, and felt worth less. While states like New York increase their infrastructure, their government, and leverage federal taxpayer dollars, not to benefit those who need the help the most, but to benefit state government. This bill starts a very important step of holding states accountable and assisting those who are most vulnerable among us. I urge my colleagues not only to support the rule, but to support the underlying bill. We have an opportunity here to make a measurable difference in the lives of those who struggle the most And this is an effort to ensure that happens. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I just remind the gentleman that under the new standards in this bill, 700,000 older Americans, vulnerable Americans, will lose their food benefits. And if that's his idea of protecting the vulnerable, we don't want your help. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Before us today, we have a difficult vote. Like many of my Democratic colleagues, I would have preferred to vote on a clean debt ceiling bill. I signed a discharge petition along with all of my Democratic colleagues to bring a clean debt ceiling bill to the House floor. But we couldn't get just 5 Republicans to join us to force that vote. That's why we're here today, because not just 5 Republicans could do that. I don't like the language in the bill to bypass environmental reviews and approve the Mountain Valley Pipeline. There are pipelines that have leaked, and there are pipelines that have leaked. I've joined Representative McClellan, Beyer, and others in the Virginia delegation in support of an amendment offered to remove that language, but it wasn't allowed to be voted upon. I don't like permitting reform that strips NEPA of its authorities. Instead of rolling back regulations, we should be adequately funding the agency so that staff can help projects be built in a timely and responsible manner. I don't like the tax cuts, but the wealthiest Americans are protected. The Trump tax scam, which was not funded, raised the debt by $2 trillion. And not an effort was made to put more duty and responsibility on those individuals. I've sponsored a bill to make billionaires pay their fair share. They should. Despite all these things that we don't like about this bill, including the addition of work requirements for SNAP recipients in their 50s, as members of Congress, we have tough decisions to make and ultimately do the best for our constituents and our country. In my district in particular, we have to protect the progress we've made in the last 2 years to providing a boost to Memphis, like health care and energy savings we've secured for seniors and throughout the district under the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. These investments are funding improvements and smart development in my district now, but Republicans have tried to defund them. We need to protect Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, but the Republican majority was trying to take away those benefits from over 20 million Americans. I'd like to ask for 30 additional seconds.
I yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you, sir.
Recognized.
We protected Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare in these bills. We needed a clean debt ceiling. We didn't get it. The fact is, the Republicans brought us to the brink because they wanted to extract a clean debt ceiling. We didn't get it. The fact is, the Republicans brought us to the brink because they wanted to extract relief. And yet, when Biden's here, no. This is extortion, but we have to deal with it. It's for the benefit of our country and the world's economy, and I will vote yes. Yield back the balance of my time.
Chair now, gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
I'm going to say my good friend, Mr. Cole, because he is my good friend, Mr. Cole, had the facts very much incorrect. The President of the United States was protecting the American people, protecting their future, and being, in essence, the great protector. While my friends on the other side of the aisle were passing legislation that was taking away H.R. 1, 30 million medical appointments for veterans, and throwing millions of Americans off of Medicaid. That is why the president was trying to get a clean debt ceiling, so we could come back as a House, Democrats working to get a fair budget bill. That did not happen, as he waited over and over again to see whether or not the Republicans would do what was done in the last administration and raise the debt ceiling, not for debt but to pay America's bills. This picture depicts, with the Speaker Emeritus and Good Hope Baptist Church, children in daycare. And under the leadership of my friends, without the work that we're doing now to pay our bills and to, in actuality, ensure that non-discretionary funding, which takes care of Head Starts and child care, would have been literally thrown out, and families would be standing in line looking for an empty chair for their child to go in so they could go to work. That's what Democrats did. And today we stand on this floor to say that we will not allow the cruelty of default. We'll not allow hostage taking. We will stand for the American people. And we will ensure that the expansion of veterans and homeless persons and children in foster care that are now able to get SNAP, that is because we continue to fight even though we could not get the Republicans to come to the table for 4 or 5 months. I offered amendments to provide an increase or provision for those students who are still in their families' homes.
Gentlelady's time's expired.
We care about America.
Gentlelady's no longer recognized. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized. Gentlelady's no longer recognized. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I continue to reserve.
Mr. Speaker, I'm now happy to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
And still I rise, Mr. Speaker, and I rise today with a testimony, the genesis of which is, I believe that President Biden did the best that he could in developing this legislation. I support him. I thank him for what he has done. I believe that Leader Jeffries did an outstanding job in making it perspicuously clear that default was not an option. But here is the essence of my testimony. I had the preeminent privilege of serving in Congress in 2008, September, I believe it was, when we had the downturn in the economy, and there was a clarion call for help to do what was called bail out the banks. I was adamantly, totally, completely opposed to bailing out the banks because I thought it was not the thing to do, given that the banks did not ask for our help in getting into the position that they were in. Well, I stood in the rear of this chamber and I could see the votes as they were being tallied. I could also see the stock market reacting to the votes as they were being tallied. The stock market went down as the bill went down. 777 points, a 7% drop in the stock market. My constituents had told me not to vote for that bill, and I concurred with them. The next day, my constituents called. Why didn't you vote for that bill? Why did you let the market go down? I learned a lesson. Votes like this are votes of conscience, and you've got to vote your conscience knowing what the consequences are. I will vote for this bill because I understand the consequences of the market tanking. I was here and I saw it. I understand that
time's
we have
expired.
to take care of our people. And I will yield back, and I thank you for the time, Mr.
I thank
Speaker.
the gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may concern. I want to
Gentleman's
thank my
recognized.
friend from Texas for his remarks. I actually voted for that bill in 2008 twice. And I'm glad that he's here today. The reality is the bill we're dealing with, it's hard to tell it listening to debate, is a compromise between House Republicans and the President of the United States. In that compromise, nobody got everything they wanted. We certainly didn't get everything we wanted. But I think we are acting together, as my friend from Texas suggested, to try and make sure that we don't default, that we don't have a day like we had in 2008. That, at least, is something we can agree on together and celebrate together, and we'll continue to try to work together. But the preeminent problem we have is my friends on the other side think we can spend forever. You know, President Obama never introduced a budget that balanced, ever. Not in 10 years, 20, or 100. Frankly, President Biden has never introduced a budget that comes into balance at any point. You can't sustain that indefinitely. This effort is to both, one, to responsibly raise our debt ceiling, but to begin to address the underlying spending problem. I wish we could have done more in that regard, but I'm glad we got done what we did, and we'll continue to work at this. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, last time I checked, the Republican conference hasn't provided us with a budget, passed a budget. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Landsman.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support tonight's vote. Vote on the Bipartisan Budget Act. There are three aspects of this bill, a bill that will avoid default, and a bill that protects Social Security and Medicare, that I hope my colleagues and fellow citizens take into account. One is that we can't keep doing this. The brinkmanship around this question of default and paying our bills has to end. It's a terrible process. Folks have been calling our offices. They're worried about their Social Security checks. They're worried about their health care. They're worried about whether or not the economy will crash. We cannot keep normalizing this behavior. Two, the bill does represent the fact that Congress is divided. The president negotiated with Speaker McCarthy, and even though a majority of Americans want Congress to balance this budget by fixing the tax code, the majority has said—
Time's expired.
Another 30 seconds.
The majority has said that is off the table. What I needed to see from this bill was that no veterans would lose their benefits and folks would continue to receive Social Security checks, and no child would lose access to food through the SNAP program. This bill does that, and so I'm voting yes. We need more bipartisan, pragmatic leaders to stand up and pass this bill tonight and to continue to work on behalf of the American people. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consider.
Recognized.
Just to quickly make a point to my friend, the Democratic Congress didn't produce a budget in 4 years. 4 years were you in the majority, not out of budget committee, let alone across the floor of the House. So you left things in quite a mess, and it's going to take a while to fix it. But we are working on a budget. I hope we get one. The reality is, though, the country has allowed itself, primarily under Democratic leadership, to get so deeply in debt, it's pretty tough to write a budget that gets us out of debt in any reasonable time. This bill is at least a step in the right direction. We would have liked to taken a bigger step. We weren't able to do that given the fact that we have a Democratic Senate, a Democratic president, both of whom seem to think they can spend endlessly, recklessly, without end, indefinitely. That's not going to happen. So sooner or later, that reckoning will come. This is an effort to forestall that and buy some time. That we worked together. I'm glad that we did. I'm glad the president came to the negotiating table despite wasting months saying that he wasn't going to. And I'm glad we made the minimal progress that we did. But let's not kid ourselves. This is the first step in the right direction, and it's not as big a step as anybody on my side of the aisle would have liked to take. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if we want to talk about messes, let me just remind everybody that the last time my Republican friends were in charge, they left us with the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. I now yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the bipartisan budget agreement and thank President Biden and his team, particularly OMB Director Shalonda Young, for putting people over politics, defending our values, and protecting the full faith and credit of the United States. My colleagues across the aisle were prepared to force a disastrous default and crash the economy into the side of a cliff. But Democrats will always put people over politics and our economy's durability over default. My friend from Oklahoma knows well that Republicans' VA appropriations bill zeroed out guaranteed funding for our toxic exposed veterans in fiscal year 25. It's in the bill in black and white, and it's why they were afraid to vote on it and pulled the bill from consideration. Democrats protected toxic exposed veterans' health care, expanded SNAP benefits to more food insecure people, and stopped Republicans' dangerous budget cuts in the Default on America Act. Yesterday, CBO officially scored the bill and found that participation rates in SNAP will increase because of this compromise. President Biden negotiated a deal that gets us through the short term and puts us in a good position to work through the appropriations process. As an appropriator, I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to efficiently finish this year's budget. And I'll remind my friend from Oklahoma that under the Trump administration, Republicans blew a hole in the deficit with a $1.5 trillion tax cut package that was unpaid for. So that's on them. I encourage my colleagues to vote in favor of the underlying legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Just to my good friend from Florida, what unbalanced the budget was COVID. And we all know that. And we worked actually together on that. But that's what spent billions of dollars in a relatively short period of time. Quite frankly, in terms of where we are today, my friends have never submitted a budget that comes into balance. President Obama did. The last president to do that was Democrat, was President Clinton. Now, we disagreed over how to get to balance, but he actually submitted budgets that came to balance in 10 years. President Obama didn't do that. President Biden hasn't done that. Until you return to the Clinton era, where you actually did believe in balanced budgets, we disagreed how to get there. I think we're going to have a hard time getting on top of our fiscal problem. But this bill, where we do agree, we don't like every part of it. We would have liked to have done more. My friends would have liked to have spent more. But the reality is it does move us in the right direction. So I'm happy for the bipartisanship, but I do note it took us a long time. And I also note from my Democratic friends, remember, so far to this point, the only people who voted to raise the debt ceiling are on this side of the aisle. My friends have not yet provided a single vote to raise the debt ceiling. Their body they control in the United States Senate has not presented a bill, let alone moved one across the floor. We did. My friends didn't like that bill. We sat down, negotiated, came to something different. But at least we voted to raise the debt ceiling. My friends who are concerned about it have neither presented a plan to deal with it nor have voted to act upon the problem. I'm hopeful today that many of them will actually join us in that effort because the President of the United States has come to the negotiating table, and we'll move forward together. But rest assured, we're not moving forward as fast as we should. We're not going as far as we should. And we've had to bring you to this point, kicking and screaming every step of the way. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
Yeah. The gentleman's absolutely right that COVID did add to the deficit, but he neglected to mention the multi-trillion-dollar tax cut for the rich that was unpaid for. Mr. Speaker, I have no other request for time. May I ask the gentleman?
Prepared to close when my friend is.
Right. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield myself the remaining time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I think there is a difference between Democrats and Republicans. I think Democrats have proven that we can govern, and Republicans have proven they cannot. We've seen the great things that government is capable of doing. In the last Congress, with Democrats in charge of the House, we invested to rebuild our neglected infrastructure, airports, roads, bridges, and ports, and all of our communities. We will see the benefits of that infrastructure bill for years and years to come. We brought manufacturing back to the United States. We passed the CHIPS and Science Act to drive innovation and create good-paying jobs. We made the largest investment in climate, protecting our water and our air. We strengthened our supply chains and set up new programs to support minority businesses. We lifted a record number of kids out of poverty in this country. We ensured that our veterans get the health care that they earned, and it's possible for us to deliver for the American people, though I haven't seen much of it this year. Instead, Republicans spent a week in January trying to elect a speaker. Republicans spent the last 5 months trying to destroy everything that we built over the last 2 years. They have only enacted 3 laws in 5 months, and those laws don't do much. The bill we are debating today may become their 4th law. It would be their biggest legislative accomplishment of the year. Think about that. The biggest accomplishment will be ending a crisis that they created. We've wasted time going back and forth on how to pay our bills. The fact that we've had to bend and contort ourselves to get this done to prevent our economy from falling off a cliff because Republicans wanted to play games is unconscionable, and it doesn't bode well for the future. Finally, let me just say to my colleagues, I plead with my colleagues on the Republican side to stop this assault against the poor. Every concession in this bill, every demand that Republicans made in this bill hurts somebody and hurts the most vulnerable in our country. Going after SNAP for older people, a measly $6 a day benefit. Shame on you for doing that. We're here to help people. We're here to uplift people. We're not here to demean people. We're not here to try to punish people. And quite frankly, the narrative that the Republicans have been utilizing in this whole debate doesn't reflect the reality. Talk to the people in your district who are struggling. Let them tell you how difficult it is to make ends meet and how maddening it is to not know whether you could put food on the table. We can do so much better. But you have to stop this assault against the poor, against the vulnerable in this country. We need to do better, and I urge all my colleagues, as we move forward in the coming months, to keep that in mind. We are here to bring everybody forward, not just a selective few. We're here to represent everybody, not just the rich and powerful and well-connected and people who give to our campaigns. And again, the contrast here, where we have members of Congress who accepted government-subsidized loan forgiveness for PPP, and they're the ones who are out here demanding that we nickel and dime programs like SNAP and TANF. It is disgusting, quite frankly, that we're even having this debate. We should be able to do so much better. Mr. Speaker, with that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts yields. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentleman's recognized.
My friend ticked through the impressive list of accomplishments of the last Congress. He forgot to mention Democrats also added $10 trillion. $10 trillion to the projected debt the United States will have to deal with over the next 10 years. Now, what $10 trillion is a lot of money. But worse than the money was the inflation that they unleashed by their reckless spending. You care about Americans, then you don't push the price up of gasoline, of home heating, of interest rates on their any purchase they make, what they pay at the grocery store. My friends managed to unleash the worst bout of inflation in 40 years. I look around this chamber, I'm probably the only guy on the floor, Mr. Speaker, that can actually remember that. This was an unprecedented disaster that they unleashed on the country. Everything in the bill that we fought for, the things that are there and the things that aren't there, were to lower the excess spending and to try and tame inflation. My friends act as if it doesn't exist. Well, I guarantee you, just go to the grocery store. Ask any American who hasn't gotten a 15 or 20% raise what their life has been like in the last 2 years. So, Mr. Speaker, in closing, I urge all my colleagues to support this resolution. With today's bill, we're putting forward common sense reforms that will save taxpayers money while also preventing an economic crisis. And the reforms included in this bill are historic. The first year-over-year cut in spending in a debt ceiling bill, the largest rescission of appropriated but unspent funds in history, the first real reforms to requirements for SNAP and TANF, which will help lift people out of poverty, and real reforms to the permitting process, which will streamline major infrastructure and energy projects and cut the red tape that are holding them back. Those are reforms, by the way, that my friends did not support. And those were things that were put in the bill by Republicans and negotiated for. Sadly, they weren't willing to work with us on those, and it was only the threat of the debt ceiling that actually brought them to the table. It's a responsible thing to do to pass this legislation, and in the end, the American people will be better off for it. I do want to be clear on something, Mr. Speaker. This is not the end of House Republicans' fight for necessary fiscal reforms. We have more than $31 trillion in debt. Programs like Medicare and Social Security, which are the bedrock of our safety net, are growing in an unsustainable manner. And for too long, this Congress has seen fit to just allow mandatory programs to eat up more and more of our budget. Indeed, the President himself refused to talk about those programs. Mandatory programs are now more than 2/3 of what we spend in any given year. Without real reforms to these programs, we'll have no chance to right the fiscal imbalance the country finds itself in. Republicans are committed to preserving America's status as the greatest nation in the world. And to do that, we must get serious about the national debt. But at the end of the day, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. This bill, Mr. Speaker, is that first step. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time and move the previous question on the resolution.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the adoption of the resolution. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
As for the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays have been requested. Those in favoring the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are orders. Member will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on adoption of the resolution will be followed by 5-minute votes on the resolution, on the motion to suspend the rules and agree to the House Resolution 382. This is a 15-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 241, the nays are 187. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, the motion reconsider is laid upon the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the vote on the motion from the gentleman from California, Mr. Isis, to suspend the rules and agree to HRES 382, as amended, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title.
House Resolution 382, resolution condemning the rise of anti-Semitism and calling on elected officials to identify and educate others on the contributions of the Jewish American community.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to HRES 382 as amended? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 429, the nays are 0. With 429 recorded as present, with 0 recorded as present, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended and the resolution is agreed to. And without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby remove my name as co-sponsor of H.R. 25.
Request is granted. Pursuant to Clause 12 of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess, subject to the call of the Chair.